Good morning. Thank you for being here today. If you would turn to the book of Esther this morning, we're going to work out of chapter 3 today. As you're turning there, I'll tell you a little story. On April 23rd, 1993, I believe, there was a 17-year-old young man or boy who looking back, may have been too young in many ways to possess a driver's license, but he had the keys to his mother's new car. And his friends, 3 friends of his, one friend and 2 brothers, all jumped into the car to go to a dance a few miles away in the next town. And this would be the report of the car ride. The 4 men got in the car and they drove safely to the dance, spending approximately several hours there. And when it was time to go home for their 12 o'clock deadline, on the way back from the dance, approximately 11:45, I'm sure leaving entirely too late that night, were in a hurry to get back so they wouldn't get in trouble. There was a slow-moving car on the road, and the driver decided to pass that car and to get home quicker. As they were doing that, the car seemed to slow down more as the car was going around them. And the driver probably wondered why the car was slowing down just a little bit. And looking back over his shoulder, he got around, and when he looked up, he realized that he was heading for a sharp corner. Braking at this point would not help, and in fact did not help, as the car went off the road and ran over several small trees and stopped a few inches shy of approximately a tree that was about 36 inches around in diameter. And if there had been a police report, although the police did show up, there was not a report because these 3 gentlemen knew the cop, and so no report was taken. But if there had been one, it would have been something probably like this. It probably would have read something like that the car was going approximately 75 miles an hour when it entered into a 25 mile an hour curve. The skid marks were approximately or prior to the impact of the edge 120 feet. And all 4 teenagers in the car walked away unhurt. And not even a minor injury, if you will. All these teenagers in their late 40s today have gone their separate ways, and in comparison, they don't talk much today. But my guess is if you got them together and you said, what was the explanation for the survival that night, my guess they would all say divine intervention. That's what I think they would say. Given the speed they were traveling, the force of the car going into the ditch, reasonably to assume that those teenagers maybe shouldn't have been alive after that night, especially if they had gone a few feet farther and ran into that big pine tree. I don't think the pine tree was moving for them. We thank God for preserving life like that. In fact, I thank God for preserving my life that night. I was one of the 16-year-olds. I was not driving, by the way, but my friend was. My other friend, Adam, and my brother were in that car. And he was driving his parents' car. And even the car pretty much survived the event with minor scratches and bruises. So really, on that night, all the parents really lost was the brand new shininess of a car. If you go through a near-death experience like that, you might reflect on some things. I'm certain that some of you have gone through near-death experiences in your life, I'm assuming. In experiences like that, our head knowledge becomes more of a reality when we go through something like that. You learn that life and death really is in God's hands. God created all people in His image, and only God has the ability to determine when life begins and when life ends. I also really learned that God preserves life to accomplish His purposes, whether people know what is going on or not. I also learned that God sometimes works in most powerful ways behind the scenes without notice. God works providentially, guiding circumstances and given situations without directly being invoked or sometimes even noticed. God sometimes guides these situations when we least know it. I remember that night in question that we all were wearing our seatbelts. Well, back then, the law had just been made that you had to start wearing seatbelts. So people didn't often wear seatbelts all the time because we didn't have to wear them. But for some particular reason that night, we all four put on our seatbelts before leaving back for home. I don't know why. Perhaps if we'd been in a different car, we were in a fairly light car. Maybe if we'd been in a heavy car, all that weight, we'd have still hit that tree. I don't know. Maybe if the driver had been going slightly faster, maybe we would have hit that tree. And if we had impacted that tree, I'm sure the results would have been different. But God maneuvers in situations and circumstances and carries out his purposes, and in many cases completely without human knowledge. And it's only after these situations, and possibly that we look back on these given situations, that we see the sovereign God guiding our circumstances, relating to that event, of course. And there is no other book that is evident than the book of Esther, I believe. So if you look in the book of Esther, it's filled with types of literary techniques that foreshadowing, for instance, or gaps in the story, or irony, and maybe even some parts parody in the book. And there's tons of lessons we can learn in the individual sections by the end of the book in Esther. So there's even the book of Esther brings the reality that sticks out in crucial terms, the salvation history, and that is, you may ask, what? Well, the salvation of the Jewish people is what the book of Esther relates to. So as we go through this, there are many ironies that are deliberately or contrary to what you might expect in this book. The Old Testament covenant, people are saved without the conventional name, Yahweh or Jehovah, or title of God ever mentioned in the book of Esther, which is quite odd for an Old Testament book where God is often mentioned, right? But we can see in the book of Esther there's this framework in which God works providentially through people. And he does this to carry out his purposes and his promises, sometimes without notice. So let's begin by reading chapter 3 of Esther. And I hope you're already there. We're going to read verses 1 through 7 and then maybe skip down to 13 where the major conflict begins. And after reading this, we'll fill in the gaps with some historical background to kind of finish this narrative. So, it says, after these things, King, and I'm not sure, it says that it's pronounced Hashaway or something like this. I looked at it as Xerxes, but I don't think that's it. So, King Xerxes honored Haman, the son of Hadaphiah, the Agagite, elevating him and giving the seat of honor higher than all the other nobles. By the way, this is the second position, it says. All the royal officials at the king gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke with him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. Then Haman saw Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honor. He was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked away to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole king of... There we go, the big word that I can't say. Xerxes. What is it? That guy, yeah. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, the month of Nisan, the pure that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and fell on the 12th day, the month of Adar. So this is the event that happens in the book of Ezra. This is the conflict that we see. So before we get started, let's pray about this, and then we'll get started. Dear Lord, we come to you humbled by the fact that when we open up the word in public, a freedom that's not given everywhere, that we can expect to hear from you. We can ask as your children that you would speak to us through your word. Help us to realize how it is spoken back then and how it continues to speak today through the life individual believers and the church. And I ask as individuals that as we go through these different circumstances, that we would see the meaning of it, Lord, that we would understand your presence today. As we read your word expectantly, we ask that you would meet us here, and we pray this in your name. Amen. So, if you can imagine a holiday where you can wear a costume and wander around the neighborhood in these festive outfits and receive sweets all around, I bet you're thinking right now, you don't need an education for that one. We already have that holiday. It's Halloween, right? Yes, but can you imagine a holiday without the zombies or the witches? Think about the best parts of Halloween. The candy and the costumes and having fun, maybe. And imagine if it was in the context of biblical grounds to celebrate. Well, I'm here to tell you there's an actual day like that. And it's called Purim, or at least how that's celebrated in the Jewish world, our community today, on the 14th or 15th day of Purim, which is the Jewish month of Adar, depending on where somebody lives, I'm told. Purim is celebrated and recognized both religiously and non-religiously to the Jews. They celebrate I think I skipped a page there. Oh yeah, don't go there. I think that is right. I think I mislabeled it. There we go. And they celebrate the salvation of the Jewish people as is depicted in the biblical book of Esther. And that's where the day of Purim comes from. What they do on this day, to celebrate this day, is they read the whole book of Ezra in one sitting. So they all sit down and read this book. And as they read it, the book reminds the Jewish people of the salvation of their ancestors from the hand of their enemies, and especially from the hand of the wicked person named Haman. In fact, every time Haman's name is mentioned in the public reading of this book, those in attendance, like all good people at sporting events, yell, "Boo!" They boo the name of Haman every single time. And then, to simulate their displeasure, they have noisemakers. And they shake the noisemakers all around. Because they want to make sure that they moralize this wicked man as a bad person. And so they demonstrate this by going around the community dressed up and shaking their noisemakers and booing Haman. And then they eat these special cookies, and they have all this fun, I guess. And then they sing this song, and it goes something like this. I'm not sure. I'm not very good at translating Hebrew, so I'm assuming this is correct because they told me it was. So, the people of Israel, they rejoice, become overjoyed when together they saw Mordecai wearing royal blue. Their salvation was from eternity, and their hope was from generation to generation. Blessed Mordecai the Jew, blessed Mordecai the Jew. So, in this festive celebration, it's a big deal, and they would sing this song on Purim, and to understand the reason, the word Purim, we must have a little knowledge about the history and the setting of the book of Esther. So, I'm going to give you a little history lesson here. The history of the book of Esther goes all the way back to the 6th century before Christ. So from the 6th century before Christ, when the Jewish people from Jerusalem were taken out and put into exile into Babylon, that's about 586 BC, historically. Within 70 years, the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persians, which brings us to the time period of Esther that takes place. So the Persians began in control, and in the book of Esther, that's who's in charge. So if you flip back a few pages and get to chapter 1, you read at the beginning of Esther, it gives us the setting here. So let's go chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Are you ready? So this is what happened during the time of the Azeris, who ruled over 127 provinces, sketching from India to Kush. At the time, King Xerxes reigned the royal throne in the citadel of Susa. That's modern Iran, if you would like to know. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave the banquet for all his nobles and officials. the military leaders of Persia, Media, and the prince and the nobles of the provinces were present. So what we learn here is that this ruler is in control of a vast empire, 127 provinces, right? And he invites all the aristocrats, all the important people from all those areas to come to his royal palace in front of his throne, right? And and it says it's a citadel of some sort. And so this vast empire, if you will, actually in context for us is East Asia to Africa. And so in the third year he holds this big party. And so they all come. And at the end of this time he decides that he wants to have his wife, Queen Vashta, come. Now, there's a bit of a gap here when you're reading the story. You don't know why this happens, why he calls her, what's going on. But he wants her to come before him with his royal crown. The indication is that she's very beautiful and he would like to show her off, is the indication. But we don't really know, we're just guessing. But she refuses to come to the king. Again, another gap in the story. We don't know why she refuses to come to see the king when he requests her presence. And so the king gets very angry at this. And so he asks his advisors, his important people around him, well, what should I do? And so, based on the counsel of his friends, the king divorces Queen Vashti. So there is some kind of irony here, perhaps. You have this king who's in control of this vast empire, and he can't even control his own wife to come and see him. So it makes him look a little weak, right? And he brought all these people here, and he's looking a little weak because the queen won't even come out, right? So how much control does he really have? But then when he divorces his wife, then he's told that he looks bad because he doesn't have a wife any longer. So they're making a fool out of this guy. And so he says, well, what should I do? They said, well, we should find you another wife. And so these same friends who suggested that he get divorced go out and they're going to find him a new wife. And so they go out and they're rounding up all the women. And so at best, this act is a bit disconcerting because he has somebody going around gathering up the best looking women so he can choose the best option to be his wife. And that is when Mordecai and Haggai in chapter 2 were introduced to them. And Hadassah in chapter 2, which is actually Esther, that's her other name, her Hebrew name, right? And so in verse 7 we read about the relationship between the two. It says, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she neither had a father nor a mother. This young woman was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure, and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. So here we read it happens that when the kings go out to collect the most beautiful women, verse 8 it says, when the king's order and edict had proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the charge of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who was in charge of the women. So now there's this thing, it becomes a pretty interesting story here, right? Esther is taken into custody, so to speak, and the king compliments this command. Here, her cousin Mordecai tells her not to reveal her identity to anybody. So this is in the story. Twice in the story, Mordecai tells Esther not to reveal her identity. Well, what's her identity? She's a Jew, right? And here again, we're not told why. We don't know why she's told not to reveal her identity as a Jew. But that's what happens. And at this point, we're kind of the fact that the king eventually falls in love with Esther, right? He just gathers up all the best looking women. And some by chance, he falls in love with a Jew, right? And this arises to the problem we see later, Without knowing her true identity, this foreshadows the problem that's coming. And is depicted in the passage of chapter 3 that we read this morning. So in chapter 3, Haman, the son of Amminadab, an Agagite, is promoted to second in command, right? And at this point, Mordecai, who we're formally introduced to, somehow decides to all of a sudden, for some unknown reason, not bow down to the person the king put second in charge. And then for some strange reason, unknown to us, after he told Esther not to tell anybody about her identity, he reveals his own identity as a Jew, right? And that's how they found out that he's a Jew, because he told these other people that he's not, and he's in some kind of position of power, right? Because they're not worried about the person, just some person that's not around, right? So he must be around in position. So the narrator in Esther has us guessing a bit here, right? Because they include these gaps of information, but we never really know why it's happening or being done. So we do have a clue, perhaps, though. As the conflict goes, the revelation here is that Mordecai is a Jew, mentioned together with the refusal to bow down. Some of us are somewhat familiar with the Ten Commandments, I'm assuming. You've heard them all, right? So the second commandment, do you all know what that is? You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness or anything in heaven above or the earth below or the water beneath, right? You shouldn't make anything else a god, right? And it goes on to say you shouldn't bow down, right? So, based on that information and the fact that Mordecai is a Jew, perhaps it has something to do with the fact that he didn't think he should bow down to somebody else that would be a god, right? We don't really know. It doesn't say. I'm just guessing that could be the reason why. He was unwilling to treat this leader as a god. But we'll never really know because it doesn't say. So now we have this conflict between Haman and Mordecai, right? And Haman is mad because Mordecai won't bow down to him when he finds out, right? At first he doesn't know until somebody tells him, which is another part of the story. We don't know why they cared, but they did. And so instead of just killing Mordecai, he has this irrational idea that he's going to kill all the Jews. Because one Jew must be bad, so they must all be bad, evidently. I'm guessing. I don't know. Or maybe just people that have that much power are always irrational. I'm not sure what the reason is. So, he casts these laws to determine when the Jewish people should be put to death. That's chapter 3, verse 7, if you want to know. And it's determined that all the Jews from the 127 provinces in this king's kingdom will be put to death on the 13th of the day of the month of Adar, almost a year after casting the lots. And although God is not mentioned in the narrative at all, God is apparently not present, or his personal name is never mentioned or revealed to the Jewish people of Israel. And it's funny, in this whole set of events, they're about to be killed and they never mention God once by name. That does seem weird. Especially when you think of the context of God's covenant people, right? This is a time when they need him the most. When they need their God, right? And they don't even call out to him, apparently, in that way. And if you look and read the whole book of Esther, it appears that he's not even present for this, right? He can't be found. So Christians, in the presence or the absence of God, in this text, it reflects us to do something. Do you ever feel that God is absent in your life? Have you ever felt that way? Has there ever been a time when you felt that way? I think many times in our lives, we feel desperate, both physically and emotionally, destitute, maybe even feeling like we are spiritually dying. And we need God. And yet, it feels to us sometimes that he's nowhere to be found. And there's a principle here in Esther, especially from chapter 3 on. When the situation looks bad, when we are going through difficult times and situations, and God seems to be absent, God is right there. He's working the situation for our good. even in situations when we have no assurance that God even cares about our situation, because it appears he's not there. But he is involved in the situation, just not as obvious or revealed to us as we would like. Here's the amazing thing that we have to appreciate as we read the book of Esther. And so as contemporary Christians, right, today, thousands of years removed from the story, right, or the event, we can appreciate here that God gives us insight into past occasions in which he is involved in human affairs to carry out his purpose for the sake of his glory and his name, growing his kingdom. And yet he's not mentioned. And it is a divine providence that we see as readers that God is without being named or officially credited in these actions, shapes the circumstances of our lives so that we might be able to accomplish his purposes. That is the goal. So as we read this narrative, we are privileged to reflect on how God might use unspecified circumstances in our own lives, in every single one of our lives, to accomplish his purpose, even though we may not be aware of it. So let's look back at these events in the story so we can see clearly the divine hand God uses here. So it just so happens, by chance, that out of all the women gathered in the 127 providences, that he finds favor with Esther, don't you think? You're telling me there wasn't one prettier than Esther? It just so happens that she found favor in the eye of the king. And it just so happens that now, in this event, she has direct access to the king because of the position of being the queen. Now, we have no idea of knowing how many women were rounded up, but I suspect it was a lot, because in one translation I read that it was called a harem. I'm assuming that's many. I don't know. And yet she was chosen. Then it just so happened that Ezra and Mordecai are related. The guy that gives Haman grief, right? And it just so happens to be that the disobedient Mordecai has access to the Persian king, right? Because of his orphan cousin that he raised. Now, out of all the women that could have married the king, and is depicted as a wide variety, a big choice, she was a Jew. And a person not obeying the king's command were closely related. Now, all this is key in tracking the story of Esther, because upon hearing the plans of to slaughter the Jewish people, Mordecai dresses in clothes representing mourning. And then he goes to the gate of the king, and because of his cousin being there, he gets access. And he tries to convince, or he does convince Esther to help her own people, as seen in chapter 4, verse 13. And these verses, which are not only a plea for personal help, it's a plea for help for the nation of Israel, right? For deliverance, if you will. You see, because in a short amount of time, Haman's going to kill all the Jews. That's his plan, right? For some odd reason, which beyond me, I don't understand, the king seems to be oblivious to the whole thing in this instance. Maybe he's too busy doing something else. I don't know. And so he tells the queen here that if she says nothing, right, if she keeps silence, right, that it won't matter. It won't change the effect, because she'll still be somehow affected by this. Being the queen of the king won't affect her, because she's a Jew, right? So she'll still get the same thing. And even if she's preserved somehow, right, that it will affect her because her whole heritage will be killed. So that's what will happen. So he says to her, your father's house will perish, right? And then it says, and who knows if you do not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So then he pleads to her and says, hey, maybe you were made for such a time as this. You were put in this position, this exact spot, for this exact reason, to save the people, right? And then he says to her, do not forget that you're a Jew, right? So you have to do something. So Esther, in return, goes to the king and tells him she's a Jew. The one thing that she wasn't supposed to do before, right? And then tells the king of Haman's plan to kill the Jews and how it would affect her. And then at the end of the story, we see Haman's taken away, and he's basically killed. We don't know if, because the language is not clear. We don't know if he's beheaded. We don't know if he's impaled. We don't know if he's just hung. We don't know how he's killed, but somehow he's killed, right? And he pleads for mercy, right? But he's killed. So the redemption of the Jewish people still does not come according to traditions we read in chapter 8. So at this point, the decree is still out that they're going to be killed, and so the king has to do something to prevent that, even though Haman's been killed and taken away, right? So the king orders another decree that basically goes against that other thing, the other order. And so based on that, the king stops the Jews from being destroyed, right? And so what happens here is this is a preservation of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. It was accomplished and occurred on the very day that Haman planned for their destruction a year later. And so based on this, the Jewish people decide that they're going to make a holiday. And they're going to celebrate this day every year called Purim that was instituted in chapter 9, verse 27. And it says this: the Jews took it on themselves to establish customs that their descendants and all who join them should be without fail to observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the appointed time. So we understand the reason for the holiday now of Purim. The day Haman wanted to destroy and set all the lots to kill the Jews. And it turned out they're celebrating how they were saved, right? But where is God in all this? God is not mentioned once. Not even the salvation of the covenant people. The Jewish people come about, and God is not mentioned once here. When they needed him the most, when things were the most dire, when it looked as if they would be eradicated. And wasn't God always supposed to be there for his people? Isn't that right? Isn't that what we know? That he says he'll protect his people? So let's deal with this question for just a second. The reality of the story is, despite the traditions you might have seen in Hollywood when they depict this story concerning the Honorable Esther and Mordecai, that these two characters, it might help us understand why God is not mentioned. First of all, there seems to be no concern for Jewish law here from either character. Unlike the book of Daniel, right, where he becomes second in command, everybody knows he's a Jew, right? So, first of all, Esther lies by omission here, right? Because she simply doesn't say who she is before the king, right? Mordecai tells her not to say, right? So the implication here is that if Esther was not going to basically tell people who she was, she had to violate the Torah, right? The purity laws, the Sabbath, food laws. Because if she did all those things, if she had acted like a Jew, the king would have known what? She was a Jew, right? It would have been obvious. If she honored the Sabbath, if she didn't eat certain food, right? Then the king would have known. Because it's strictly forbidden, right? Also, the other thing that's maybe a bit disturbing is she married a Gentile. And not only that, she was with the Gentile before they got married, right? And it tells us here that although it's not forbidden to marry a Gentile, typically the rule is that you only marry a Gentile if that Gentile is going to serve the one true God. There's no indication here that the king wants to serve the one true God, right? It's never presented. And it's depicted here that based on all the events, the Mordecai or Esther had no interest in following the laws either. And so it opens up this perfect opportunity for our sovereign God, the God of Israel, and all the people to hear the story that he's in control. God demonstrates his ability to control all circumstances and all situations for his glory. And so, to what end did he save the Jewish people in this story? Because he's not even invited in the narrative or in their story, right? Why does he save them? Well, the answer is simple, I think. God does not save people because they're extraordinary in themselves. God does not save people because they are good. God saves people because he is a magnificent God, right? God saves people because he demonstrates his love despite all of us not inviting him into our lives, right? If he saved us based on our goodness, how far do you think we're going to get? Not very far, I don't think, right? God saves people because he is a loving God who keeps his promise. What promise was he keeping here? Well, we don't have to go very far back in the Bible to find that. Because this, as believers, should drive us to praise. All the way back in Genesis 3. Does anybody remember what happened in Genesis 3? The story of Abraham, right? And what does he say? He says all nations will be blessed through him, right? And we see over and over, not because they're particularly good, right? And if you want to know about that, go to Romans chapter 9 and we'll explain the whole reason why we're not good, right? As we go through the Old Testament, we see Jacob, who was renamed Israel, had 12 sons. And out of those 12 sons, one's named Judah, right? Which is where we get the name Jewish from, right? Chosen to be the royal lineage, i.e. the King David, right? And Jesus the Messiah is a descendant of David. And King Jesus was promised to come from the royal line of the Jews to all humanity, right? God is and was determined to bring a blessing to all humans through the Jewish nation by the way and the work of the Messiah. So in this way, Esther is a much bigger part of the picture, right? Not because they were inherently good and were doing the right thing, right? Because all the way back to Abraham, God promised, and until today, in fact, all the way through the church, right? He promises that he's going to make a great nation. And that's the reason why. And so if Haman had succeeded, right? And if the Jewish people would have been destroyed, then his promise wouldn't have been fulfilled, correct? God promised to save the people and all others through him would not have existed. And the fulfillment of his promise was what was at stake in this story. God cannot and will not let his word fail. So regardless of the people he's involved with, regardless of if they're good or if they're bad or if their intentions are good or whether they're inviting God into their lives, he will providentially work behind the scenes to keep his word regardless of people's indifference to God. He will keep his promise, and this should drive us to praise. This is how Esther is part of the Christian's history. This is how humanity was saved from sin. So this book appears to be written for the times when God appears to be silent in our lives or in the world. That's what it appears to be. You see, there's times when we don't see God's hands at work. There's times when we don't feel God is around us. There are times when God doesn't appear to be as active as we would like. But sometimes that's when God is most active, when we don't even know it or when we think he's not. Sometimes when we don't even know it, God is in the act of preserving life and saving his people. And saving lives so that he might accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And sometimes that's the problem. We don't see the bigger picture. We don't know, right? We don't understand what's behind the scenes or what's going on. So I think back to my story, right? In the car accident, how was God working behind the scenes that night, right? Because if I hadn't been saved that night, I wouldn't be here this morning, right? I wouldn't be doing the purpose that God wanted me to do. So for me, he wants me to be involved in this ministry because he had a plan, right? He was behind the scenes working that night when we could have all easily, four of us, been killed in that car accident. Or at the very least me. I was in the passenger side and the tree was right in front of me. So I was the first one to go, What we need to understand this morning, that God works in our lives, even though sometimes we don't see it or know it. Sometimes it feels like He's not working in our lives, but He is, providentially speaking, right? Because at that point in my life, I wasn't serious about God, like many others, right? I was a 16-year-old boy. I knew about God. I came to church, but I wasn't serious about serving God. I wasn't serious about doing the things that God wanted me to do in my life. I mean, we went to a dance that night. We weren't doing God's work. At least I don't think we were, right? But it's important to know that God is working in any circumstances you are in, right? So whatever you're going through today, whatever thing that's in your life today, understand God is working through that. We may not understand how. We might not understand why. We may even wonder why we're going through these circumstances. And then sometimes we may even wonder, why is God not answering my prayer? Why does God seem to be unavailable or unpresent in these situations? It's because behind the scenes, He is working for every circumstance and every situation. And He is perhaps preserving life, right? And perhaps He has a plan that we don't know about. But we do know this. The book of Esther specifically shows us this. He is in control regardless of the situation we're in today or the circumstances that we see before us. Even when we don't understand and we don't know why, He is in control. And that's what the book of Esther here gave us to tell us, right? That God's in control no matter the situation. No matter what happens in our lives, He is in control. So, with that understanding, when we're in circumstances, when we're in a situation that we feel that's out of control, the one thing we can do, we can turn it over to God, right? We can sit there and say, you know what, you're in control. And although I don't understand why, and I don't understand why you wouldn't make it a different situation. Because often that's the question. Too often, what do we see? Good people that go through horrible things, right? And then we sit there and we look around and we say, horrible people, they get all the good things, right? Don't we see that every day in our life? We go through things in our lives that we don't understand, sicknesses or whatever it is. The point is, God is in control and He has a purpose. And we have to be faithful to understand that there's a purpose for whatever we're going through. And then beyond that, whatever happens, whatever the outcome is, we have to understand that God's in control and it's for His purposes and His glory. Because the life that we live here is all about living for God's glory. We are dependent. We are more than that. We are commanded to live a life that does something for God's glory. Because what we do here is a short amount of time. Because in reality, we're living for eternity. And it's what happens in eternity, right? It's not what happens here. We do what we're supposed to do here because God gives us command. But we're living for a greater purpose. That's our time in eternity with God in heaven. That's the purpose. So He is in control regardless of what's going on. And that's the thing that we need to remember. Let us pray. Dear Lord, we thank You today the fact that You are in control of our lives, regardless of when it seems like things are out of control, spiraling in a situation that we have no control, Lord. That behind the scenes, that somehow, even when maybe it feels like You're not there, that You are. And that You're a great God. And that You're our God. And that You are there working for the purposes that You have designed. And for the best purpose of our lives, even though we may not see it. That You are working what is best for the promise that You've made to us and that You intend to keep. And so we thank You for that today. We love You, Lord, and we're grateful. We ask this in Your name. Amen.